Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode of Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. And tonight it is our great honor to host Asim Qureishi, who hails from the UK, and he represents the organization CAGE. We have featured CAGE previously, but tonight we have a special emphasis on recent developments in the UK, specifically around a initiative known as Prevent. Asim, assalamu alaikum.
I understand.
Thank you very much and welcome to Legal Ease.
No, thank you for having me.
Now, Asim, what background do we have regarding CAGE? What can you tell us about your organization?
CAGE is an independent advocacy group that basically was founded in order to try and counteract some of the abuses that were being perpetrated as part of what's known as the global war on terror. So in particular, we started off looking at prisons like Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, the network of secret prisons that the CIA were using around the world. But then further than that, we started to look at how counterterrorism legislation and policy was being implemented in countries all over the world, and how those policies were basically destroying concepts of due process and the rule of law, and resulting in a number of unlawful arrests and detentions, ultimately resulting in often in torture and in some cases even extrajudicial killing.
So it's not specifically confined to UK citizens. I mean, you take an international view of these events.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a large part of the work that I've done has been around the world. So I travel to different parts of the world, investigating abuses wherever they're being perpetrated. I've traveled across Eastern Europe, South Asia, the Middle East, even the Horn of Africa. So there's a lot of work, unfortunately, to be done everywhere. And we're trying our best in quite difficult circumstances.
Right. Now, some of the prisoners that you visited or you know of in Guantanamo Bay, I remember recently you gave a talk on that. But some of these were pretty gruesome and included children as well. The incarceration of families was not uncommon. This has happened where entire families were used by the prison authorities to try and extract information. What can you tell us about some of these matters that you've dealt with?
Yeah, I mean, we just have to look at the case of a young girl named Hafsa Saleh Ali. So in 2007, when I was in Kenya investigating human rights abuses there, what we found was that the Kenyan Anti-Terrorism Police Unit was rounding up families, not just men, and placing them in unlawful detention. Now Hafsa was a 4-year-old child who was kidnapped by the police unit, kept in a cell for a month without a mattress or a blanket, and this was in the winter in Kenya, so it was extremely cold. And poor Hafsa, she suffered a lot of trauma. But what was really, I think, quite incredible about this situation was that they interrogated her. I mean, a 4-year-old child can't really tell you anything about anything really, and yet they interrogated her for that period of the month, asking, "Where's your father? Where can we find him? Where did you last see him?" So on and so forth. So, I mean, Hafsa obviously wasn't able to tell them anything. When she was finally released, because of the trauma that she suffered, every time she saw an African man in a uniform, even if he was just a cleaner in a building, she would actually soil herself because she wasn't able or capable of overcoming the trauma that she faced from African men in uniforms who had detained her during that period of time. So we're talking about the kind of the systematic abuse of not just men but women and children as well, outside of what we would consider to be the rule of law.
And with regard to the rule of law, I mean, in your experience, you're finding more and more the erosion of the rule of law, with specific reference to what we're trying to discuss this evening, Prevent. What can you tell us? How can you enlighten us about Prevent, its origins and its international and local impact?
Sure. So Prevent started off after the London bombings in 2005, what's known as 7/7. And the Prevent strategy was basically the government getting together with a group of communities, kind of community leaders in the UK, as well as some Securocrats. And they asked the question, how can we stop 7/7 happening again? So the idea was to basically prevent acts of terrorism by trying to cut it off at its root. Now, they came up with a kind of a pseudoscience about how this works. So they invented this notion of what's known as the conveyor belt to terrorism, or the conveyor belt to radicalization theory, which has no scientific basis. There's no empirical data. There's never been any studies to suggest that this theory actually has any legitimacy. But what they said was that there is a certain route that people take. And initially it was called countering violent extremism. That was the emphasis, that they wanted to stop violence from taking place, which is something that we can all agree with. But the way that they went about it was that they funneled money into organizations that they liked, that would support a government narrative about the way that the war on terror works. So these organizations specifically, they denied that there was any link between foreign and domestic policy and terrorism. They focused purely on ideology as being the key. So they said, well, it's all to do with radical imams, mosques, these are the problems, this is what you need to target, you need to kind of make changes here. Whereas what the community was saying, what young people were saying, was actually it's not our mosques are perfectly fine, there's nothing wrong with them. What we do have a problem with is government policy in relation to being involved in rendition, torture, extrajudicial killings, unlawful wars perpetrated on false bases. This is what the communities were saying, but unfortunately government wasn't listening. So this is really where Prevent began in its genesis.
So, but Prevent is a government initiative.
Mm-hmm.
So if we isolate Jihadi John, for example, as as somebody that you've commented on previously, you've known him personally,
mm-hmm.
and from what we've read, and I think there's been wide acceptance that he was not a violent young man. He wasn't radicalized one morning, getting out of bed and walking around with a machete.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to him particularly? And he's a good example, I think, of what you believe is a system that radicalizes rather than being radical from within.
Yeah, sure, and absolutely, we can talk about that. I mean, I think the important thing with Jihadi John, or allegedly Jihadi John, so
mm-hmm.
we'll refer to him as Muhammad Mwazi because he's never had a trial yet.
Yes.
And until he's had a trial, we shouldn't really specifically say that he is Jihadi John.
Right.
But supposing he is, what we can say is that there's two aspects to the story.
Right.
There's the aspect of what happens in the UK, and then the aspect of what happens after he leaves the UK. After he leaves the UK, we know very little about what happened to him. So we can't really comment about his entry into ISIS and his subsequent becoming Jihadi John. But what we can talk about is, here is a young man who was in the UK, who went on a trip to Tanzania with his friends,
mm-hmm.
who is stopped in Tanzania, who's sent back. He's not really told why. He's just told that it's maybe something to do with the UK feeling there's a national security threat. On his return, he's questioned by the security agencies, who ask him his opinions about 7/7, 9/11, and of key importance, whether or not he would come and work for them. But they're trying to basically make his life difficult. They're
mm-hmm.
trying to say that, look, we think there's a problem with you, and the only way you're going to be able to come out of that problem is if you come and work for us. That way we'll know that you're okay. Now, he wasn't particularly interested, because he wasn't interested in being a spy in his own community. And so he said, well, look, thanks, but no thanks. That's not really my thing. What's interesting after this is that he actually goes and tries to make a life for himself in Kuwait. So he has a job there. He tries to get married twice. But what we saw is the security agencies actually impacting on his life from behind the scenes.
Right.
So they call up the family of the girl he was first engaged to, and and say to her family that, look, you need to reconsider this, or basically say, well, do you know that he's somebody of interest for her? So her family cut off the engagement. They stop him from being able to travel out of the UK to Kuwait again, where his job was waiting for him. So there were all of these key pressure points. But instead of, you know, going out there and, I don't know, committing an act of violence or whatever else, he came to our organisation and said, look, I'm under this pressure. I don't know what to do. So we get him in touch with lawyers. We get him in touch with the media. We speak to politicians. We get him to access his embassy. So he's using all the mechanisms of state to do what? To bring about a change in his situation. But the problem is that the security agencies are unaccountable. How do you challenge a decision that they've made about you when there's no legal structure that allows you to challenge that decision? And this is the key problem here. He wasn't able to actually challenge that in a meaningful way, leading ultimately, we believe, to him wanting to leave the UK and not wanting to be part of that system anymore.
Okay, that might just be a convenient place to pause. We're going to come back. Please stay tuned and join us after the short break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. And this is a pre-recorded show, and tonight we're speaking of an initiative that has been identified by Cage UK, emanating from the UK, and a program known as Prevent. And I'm hosting tonight Asim Qureishi from Cage, who is a research director at Cage. Just before the break, Asim, we were talking about what options were left to, I mean, we're referring to him colloquially as Jihadi John, because I think that's how the media has put him, if we put his name forward. Having turned everywhere, he now came to you. He seemed to have very, very little options left open to him. What happened then?
Well, you know, this is the interesting thing for us. We want to know more about, you know, why it is that he decided to make that jump outside of the UK in the end. And really, I mean, what we can say is that from all the evidence that we've gathered, and we released all of the email communications that I had with him, and even the journalist that was talking to Muhammad Mwazi, you know, released some of the emails that they had. And what was he talking about? He was saying like he felt like he was in a cage in London. He felt like his life was being restricted. Even with the journalist, he was mentioning how he's feeling suicidal at times, like he felt like he was a dead man walking. And so when you restrict somebody's life in such a way and don't give them any options, and at least don't give them a recourse towards justice in some way, then, you know, they feel like their world becomes extremely small. And I feel, based on all the evidence that we've gathered, that he must have left the UK because he had very few options actually left to him. And if you speak to anybody who knew him, you know, I knew him myself as a client. You know, I thought he was a very genuine individual who, you know, there was nothing that would indicate that he had a violent streak. But forget about my opinion. You know, his teachers talked about how kind and generous he was. His employer said that he was one of the best employees that he ever had. So there was this kind of consistency of narrative about who this young man was before he left the UK. So of course we don't really know what happens once he leaves the UK and goes to Syria, but we do know, or it's assumed or alleged, that he then goes on to become Jihadi John. And that's true. Then really what we need to do is we have to understand the UK portion of his story, because unless we do, we will never really be able to learn lessons from it. And this is what Cage has been calling for. We've been calling for accountability.
Right.
We want the security agencies to be held accountable, to hold themselves to account, in fact, to become a better organization. Because if you don't learn lessons from your own actions, then how can you move forward? And how can you then make sure that those mistakes aren't repeated again? And that's really what Cage is about. We're calling for this accountability. Unfortunately, you know, they don't really want to engage in that process.
But the program Prevent was created to do what? I mean, what is the basis of such a program? What does it really mean, and how does it play out in daily life?
Well, I mean, since 2007 when it first started, 2005 when it first started, that actually shifted in its narrative somewhat. So it was about countering violent extremism, and it's now changed its policy to countering extremism itself. So it's no longer just about violence. In 2011 they changed their strategy and they made it about what's inside the heads of people that they consider to be extremists, because their notion is that if you engage in extremist ideas, then that once again puts you on this conveyor belt to potential acts of terrorism. You know, like I mentioned earlier, this is a pseudoscience. There's no data that tells us this is an empirically sound or logical conclusion to reach. I mean, how do you prove causation between reading a book and, you know, committing an act of terrorism? I mean, by that standard, you know, anybody who, you know, read the works of Steve Biko, for example, in the South Africa context that we're in, you know, could be considered a potential extremist. But we know that actually, you know,
well, even our late President Mandela.
Of course, you know, that these are enlightening works. These are works that actually helped society to become a better place, in fact. But of course, if you take a certain narrative, a security narrative about them, then of course you'll come to some flawed conclusions. And especially when you strip the ideas from the political context that they exist in.
Yes.
So that's the key. What they want to do is they want us to think that this ideology or this kind of revolutionary thinking or potentially violent thinking even exists outside of an environment where there's foreign conflict, where there's abuses and torture taking place, whereas actually that is the reality. And people who then engage in these ideas engage in it because they feel so disenfranchised with the current situation, with the reality that they live in. And so this is really where we're at with Prevent. And you know, we've dealt with many cases where individuals, because of what's inside their head, have been criminalized.
That's amazing, because the theory in law is mere thoughts are not punishable.
Absolutely.
That has always been the theory of law. It's only an animus combined with actus, with an act that could lead to a criminal conviction. So right now, what you're saying is people are being persecuted just on the thoughts that they might have.
Yeah.
But tell us about some of the cases that you've come across, because it sounds pretty ominous, this Prevent program.
So, I mean, just recently the UK government, they brought into law an act called the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, which makes this Prevent program a statutory duty. That means every single doctor, nurse, optician, teacher, university lecturer, even down to the childminders who take care of very, very small babies, they are all under what's known as a statutory duty to prevent individuals from being drawn into terrorism. This is how the language that they use. So this has only just recently come in, but even before that, when it was a non-statutory duty, when they were just recommending it, I and my organization have been dealing with about over 100 cases now. So let me give you some examples from different areas. So in schooling, for instance, we had one case where a 9-year-old child was taken out of his school classroom and asked by a teacher, what is your opinion on the Middle East conflict, the conflict between Israel and Palestine? I mean, a 9-year-old doesn't really know, hasn't really kind of developed a cogent thought about these things. And often you take your children to protests where they're hearing the slogans of a protest. So, for example, the kind of left-wing protests that, you know, I take my children to often, you know, they have slogans like no justice, no peace.
Right.
Now, if a Muslim child says that, that can be perceived within a certain environment that might be considered to be extremist or considered to be radical, but actually this is something that's praiseworthy, that they're engaging in these democratic processes, raising their voice against something that they consider to be unjust.
Right.
So that's just one example. I think.
So you're actually told, or you are dictated to what your opinion should be about what is just and unjust. So
well, I mean, it's even worse than that, because you're actually reported to Prevent police officers that this child has this potential risk of becoming an extremist because he has these beliefs. I mean, it makes something that's quite normal and political into something that's potentially a future act of terrorism. But I think a case that I think was even more frightening than that, within the schooling system at least.
But in that case, the child was actually removed. So the child was asked to volunteer an opinion that the child never expressed
Absolutely.
before.
Without the parents being present.
Oh, no.
So there's no right, for example, for the parents to say, we should have been in that meeting, or that our child had right to legal counsel. So that's an interesting part of the way in which this is being applied, which is that you're asked to be making statements or answer questions without any representation, even from an adult. Going on to the other case, a child, 14 years old, in school, he gave a presentation on the difference between the Islamic State of history, which made contributions to, and he evidenced this, to
Yes.
art, to science, to mathematics,
Yes.
to medicine, and he really went into a lot of detail, and then said how this was different than the Islamic State that they talk about in Iraq and Syria. The teacher was so amazed by this presentation, she wrote back to the parents to say, wonderful, except that a third-party source had heard about the presentation and reported it to the Prevent Police, and that child now has a file on the criminal database for the police, what's known as CrimInt. So, this is the kind of situation we're talking about here. People who don't understand the politics or even religion, they are making assessments about young people who they should be actually giving space and freedom to engage in these ideas and speak about these things. They're making them feel like if they speak openly, then they might be criminalized for doing so.
But more ominous than that is the fact that the statutory duty was not even on the third party, but the third party volunteered. So it's almost as if you can expect anyone to say anything about you, and you can be held liable for that.
Absolutely, and it just doesn't apply to those in your care, it also applies to colleagues.
Right.
So one lady in an NHS hospital who works just in admin, she took a year off work. During that year she found religion, she came back wearing the headscarf, and what we found, or what she found, was that her colleagues, instead of asking her, oh, you're wearing a headscarf, that's new, can you tell us about it, that they immediately reported her to Prevent Police officers. And those police officers then came to the hospital, and in front of all of her patients and other staff members started asking her opinion about the Islamic State, about the Middle East conflict, about what her views on different religious groups were, and so on and so forth. So you have this bizarre situation where your own colleagues, people you work with on a daily basis that you should have relationships with, can start reporting on you because they're worried that you might be on a pathway to something just because you've displayed an overt kind of symbol of religiosity. And I think that's extremely dangerous, because we start getting into a state then which where people become scared to express themselves. And we know that traditionally when people become frightened to express themselves overtly, they become suppressed, and then they start looking at ways that are more underground to discuss ideas and to engage in those thoughts and beliefs. And that's what you don't want. You want the debate to be open, you want to engage, and you want to be able to argue against people who are coming up with ideas that we as society don't consider to be acceptable. But this is about the neutralization of that space, and that is what we're trying to avoid. And that's why CAGE has very much committed to campaign against this. And the worst thing about it all is that the UN Security Council just recently passed a resolution making what this whole international program is known as CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, as being something that all states should apply. So that means that all countries in the world, because a UN Security Council resolution has been passed, are under a duty now to implement it in some form or another within their national legal system. And I think that is extremely dangerous. And the last thing we want is this program in the UK to be implemented elsewhere.
And on that interesting note, it's time for another short break. Please stay tuned and join us after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You are tuned to Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. And tonight we are hosting Asim Qureishi from an organization known as CAGE UK. And we're speaking of a program created and developed in the United Kingdom known as Prevent. It's a piece of legislation that allows someone to report you if they believe that you hold radical views. We were told just before the break that even the United Nations Security Council has now got into the initiative and will possibly demand similar kind of legislation around the world. Asim, it's quite surprising that even the United Nations would get involved in something like this. So it looks like there's common cause that any kind of behavior that they consider threatening to the state could be reported.
Absolutely. And we've actually seen historically this in many different contexts,
yes.
actually. And this is one context that I think is very, very familiar with this type of response to what they might think of as seditious views, which actually for many people is just normal political behavior. But in terms of the UN's implementation of this, and we've actually seen it for quite some time. The US implemented it, the Prevent strategy, took it directly from the UK in 2012 and has been trying to further that over the course of a few years. Australia has a similar type of model. So there are countries, especially within the Western world, who have been pushing this agenda for quite some time. I mean, once again, it comes back to this lack of empirical data about how it is that terrorism occurs, but also the way in which we counteract it. And because they're not willing to deal with the root cause of terrorism, you have this completely flawed analysis on which their entirety of their policy is based. So this is the situation that we're in right now.
But the impact is quite far-reaching. For example, I mean, even your children can be removed, right?
That's right. In fact, we're dealing with 5 cases already where children have been made wards of the court. So they've been removed from their parents because an assessment was made that by being in the household of their parents, they might be susceptible to radical ideas or extremist ideas. And so these children were removed. Our judiciary, the UK's Judiciary Council, just recently released guidance on how the judges should be understanding making children wards of a court where there is a risk of radicalization. Now the problem with this is, how do you challenge this then? Because in the UK we have a system of the security state being allowed to present in under secret conditions. So for example, if somebody's children are taken away from them on grounds of extremism, and you have to understand that extremism, by definition, as it's defined within the Prevent strategy, is going against fundamental British values. That's how they define it. Okay. So they define that as the rule of law, kind of tolerance for others. Extremism is when you call for the death of the armed forces, for example. So I mean, it's a very, very vague and broad definition. To be against British values, when British values themselves are not easily defined.
Right.
So, imagine they make an accusation of extremism against somebody, and the court makes an assessment that the children should be taken away and placed with another family. Then how do the parents challenge that? So they go to the court and they make an application to challenge, and the court says to them that the decision that was made by the security agencies. And so, because it's a national security case, this is going to be in secret evidence. And so the parents are not permitted to know what the case is against them. Their lawyers are not permitted to know what the case is against them. The government is permitted to present their case in a closed door scenario, so everybody is removed. The person that represents the interest of the parents is what's known as a special advocate. So this special advocate sits in the court and he represents the interests of the parents, except he's not permitted to speak to the parents. So he has no way of knowing whether or not the information that's being presented is true or false. He just has to do the best job he or she has to do the best job that they possibly can in representing the rights of their clients. So this is what we have right now, where the entire system is stacked against you. They've changed and subverted the entire concept of a rule of law in order to centralize all these powers to themselves. So it becomes very difficult then to challenge that. And even in this new Counterterrorism and Security Act that I spoke about earlier, there is a clause in there that says when they make an assessment that you are a child or even an adult that's at risk of radicalization, they will come to your parents to seek consent. And where consent isn't achieved, then they're able to go away and think about options within the social services. So for those of us who know how that operates, what that means is that social services can then intervene and make an assessment about whether or not the child should be removed from that process. And this is all in the statute book. So it's all extremely scary, and it's a really terrible time. And we're trying our best to counteract. And it's great that we've got a number of trade unions who are fighting alongside us, a lot of human rights organizations, a number of allies, especially within the academic world, who know and understand that this is an extremely dangerous precedent for a fair and just society.
But on a precedent level, isn't that the same precedent they use in Guantanamo when you have an accused in a court, an enemy combatant that doesn't have the right to legal counsel of his choice or the right to evidence against him? Isn't that the same?
It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same process. Secret evidence being presented in the same way. They just basically took that model and legalized it, and that's the most horrific part of it. That we're not talking about an illegal court like Guantanamo. What they did is that they passed actual statute law. So they made the entire process legal, but instead of keeping it within the criminal jurisdiction, they moved all of these sanctions into the civil system so that they could get over the burden of proof, because the burden of proof in criminal law is extremely high.
Yes.
And they moved the entire system into the civil system so that they could lower the burden of proof and bring in civil
balance of
secret evidence.
Yes.
Exactly.
But it's evidence you can't even challenge. That's the amazing thing.
Absolutely.
Your children can actually be removed then?
Yes, they can, and they are being removed already. We're already dealing with cases where they have been removed from their parents.
So with regard to the rights that you said that these parents, they don't have, do they have a right of appeal, or what options would be open to them?
I mean, they do have that right of appeal, but it's to this special court known as the SIAC court, the Special Immigrations Appeals Commission. So this court was specifically convened actually to deal with immigration cases, but in a post 9/11 environment. It started looking at deportation cases, what's known as control orders, which is a form of house arrest, citizenship deprivation cases as well. So we have all of these sanctions that can be used against you, and all of it is in this national security paradigm. All of it relates to the government being permitted to present secret evidence. So if you are placed on this electronic tag order where you're restricted to your home or to a very small geographical area, then to challenge that, you are placed on this electronic tag and you have to challenge in secret. Similarly, if you're not just somebody who's a dual citizen, if you're somebody who's capable of applying for a citizenship elsewhere, then they can strip you of your citizenship, because they claim that because, say for example, you're able to apply for citizenship in Pakistan, that because you're an extremist, that they can take your British citizenship away from you. So this is the environment that exists currently. It's all of this civil law being used in order for the state to centralize powers to itself, to be able to make quick, arbitrary judgments, because that's what it is. The security agencies giving a file to the Home Secretary, and the Home Secretary signing off and saying, yes, this person should be put under this sanction. There's no trial in advance. There's no case in advance. It's just an arbitrary decision, which when you then challenge, has to be challenged in secret.
I must say, it does resonate with us, because having come from an apartheid state, each of these things, forced separations, banning orders into homelands where you couldn't have access to anyone, your rights were removed, you could even be deported, you could even be abducted and brought into the country to face trial. So all of the extrajudicial means appears to us historically, we identify with that, but very surprising that this kind of legislation exists today in a first world country.
I think what we have is a climate of fear that exists. The threat of terrorism has been you know, has been kind of exploding so much. They've used it in order to make people scared. And when people become scared, they tend to allow the state to centralize powers to itself and are willing to give up rights in order to you know, kind of deal with this perceived threat. But unfortunately, what happens in the circumstance is that legislation and those policies end up affecting people that the initial legislation wasn't intending to do. So, for example, we're already seeing environmental activists being, you know, scrutinized under anti-extremism legislation. We've seen even previously how bankers were extradited to the US, even though those extradition laws were specifically brought in to deal with Muslims living in the UK. So you've got this
unintended consequences.
It's called the law of unintended consequences, absolutely. And this is where we are right now, that, you know, the law, or should we say the lack of law, the vacuum of law, has resulted in so many other groups now being affected. But I think you know, it's not really a benefit, but the consequence of that is that people are now slowly starting to see that actually there is a problem here. In fact, Julian Assange did a video for Cage not too long ago, where he spoke specifically about why it is that we need to deal with the surveillance state. Because if they are targeting Muslims now, for sure that will eventually target then other communities later on. And it's important that we then push back against that, so that we have societies that are built around justice and the rule of law, and not built around legislation that comes from fear.
On that point, we're just asking you to stay tuned. We're going for a short break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a reminder that you're tuned to Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. And tonight we are hosting Asim Qureishi from Cage, UK, who is visiting South Africa. And he's informed us of a program in the United Kingdom that's colloquially known as Prevent, but with very, very ominous signs of how this program is unfolding and what it could mean for many, many people in different parts of the world. Azim, just historically, I mean, this is not the first time, surely, that the state responds in the manner that it has done. The erosion of civil liberties, detention without trial, no rule of law. Where have we seen this before?
Well, I mean, we've just spoken a little bit about the apartheid era, you know, and you gave some, you know, very precise examples of how there is this symmetry between the way that fear is used to create the security state. But it's really interesting because just earlier this year, a new book was released called The Phantom Terror by a historian, Adam Zamoyski. Now, what he does is he charts how the French Revolution resulted in this fear that gripped the monarchies of Western Europe, and how those monarchies then responded to this notion that revolutionary thought would start to seep into their society. And you had, you know, kind of this level of repression taking place against the philosophies of the Enlightenment in particular. So, you know, people like Voltaire, Rousseau, Descartes, Locke, Montesquieu, they were all seen as being kind of seditious in their thinking. And so all of these monarchies responded to that. But what's interesting is that within that context of that repression, you had these individual incidents, and this is all in the kind of early 1800s.
Yes.
So you have, for example, one incident where a young man who very much believes in the philosophy of the Enlightenment and in all this kind of revolutionary thought, he takes a knife and he stabs a minister who he believes to be responsible for some of this repression, and then stabs himself as well and attempts to take his own life. And, you know, Zamoyski actually entitles that chapter Suicide Terrorists. So, you know, we're often told that the threat of Al-Qaeda is a new threat. And that this kind of thing has never happened before. But actually, when we read history, we see that these things have happened before. And what's interesting is that the response to that threat has happened before as well. So we've been speaking a bit about prevent. And what's interesting, and I spoke about this kind of conveyor belt radicalization theory, this theory that if you look at it's the thinkers and the ideologues of those movements, and in the UK they specifically mention certain scholars or historical scholars, in fact, who are problematic, that if you read their thinking, that leads to some form of revolutionary thought, which leads to a worldview, which leads to potential acts of terrorism. Now, what's really fascinating is how in Zamoyski's book, he shows how there were certain ministers who used exactly the same argument. They said the encyclopedists and the philosophers, it's their thinking that leads to this revolutionary thought, which leads to this kind of worldview, which leads to acts of political violence by these students. And said
regime changes.
So the entire thing that they said is that we need to stop the thinking of the philosophers themselves. We need to ban their books and burn their books. We need to stop university lecturers who are teaching this stuff from being able to teach it. Otherwise, how do you prevent, and that's the exact word they use, this form of political violence taking place? So they started arresting lecturers in universities from teaching these ideas. And what I find most horrific and ironic, in fact, is that it's actually today in the UK, it's the liberals who take their entire tradition from the philosophies of Locke and Voltaire, who are now perpetrating this narrative against Muslim communities and that same radicalization theory. But they were the ones who are having this entire false causation narrative being applied against them, just 200 years ago. So we have a bizarre situation where the abused are now perpetrating those same abuses, all in the name of terror, in the name of fear. And so I think it's really important that actually we learn from this history. And it's not just that history. If you look at the entire period of colonization, we had exactly the same processes taking place as part of what were known as counterinsurgency strategies. It wasn't just about quelling insurrections, it was about actually seditious ideas as well. But
you always had to have a common enemy for that to work. Like, again, going back to the days of apartheid, we had first Swart Gevaar, which is black danger, and then we had Rooi Gevaar, which is red danger coming from the communists. And so again, legislation was passed that you could not read certain books, you could not possess certain books. I think you didn't even see a picture of Mandela till 1988, thereabout, 89. It was seditious to even possess a picture of Nelson Mandela. But what you're saying is very interesting. So the historical route, it's not something new. I think even George Orwell warned about in 1984 that there will become, the state apparatus would be used to observe every movement of its citizens.
Absolutely. I mean, to say that we're living in kind of an Orwellian dystopia, I think is, putting it mildly. I don't think even Orwell would have predicted where we are right now. His book is very much a warning that don't fall for this politics of fear. But unfortunately, that's exactly what we've fallen for. Europol does statistics on terrorism every single year. And they found that less than 2% of terrorism, political acts of violence in Western Europe that occurs every single year, less than 2% is perpetrated by so-called Islamist extremists or so-called Islamist terrorists. The rest of it is all being perpetrated by far-right or far-left groups. But the overwhelming emphasis on tackling this threat is very much based on Muslim communities, and that shows you how fear works. Fear is an entire industry, and they've developed all of these counter-terrorism policies and legislations and institutions, and the sheer volume of money that's pumped into this kind of security industrial complex really shows you what fear does to you in the end. and how it can totally change your perception of what reality is.
And technology is also used quite significantly. Now you have facial recognition technology while you're walking in the street. It could identify anyone with a backpack as a threat. You could enter into any store, and you could be reported just from the way you look.
Absolutely.
And it's quite frightening when you understand that there's such a stripping away of individual rights.
What we're talking about here is really the economies of fear. An entire economy is based around people being scared of the other, scared of the unknown. The government placing narratives within the media, making people feel like if they're not safe, that somehow they might get harmed themselves. But we have to get a level of a reality here about what the threat is and how we respond to that threat, and also whether or not we're making it worse. And that's really what CAGE is here to do. That's our entire mission, is to try and bring reality and to advocate what just and rule of law positions are on all of these issues.
Assuming some of our viewers would like to know more about CAGE, how would they contact you, and where would they? I understand that you started CAGE Africa.
That's correct. Yes,
okay.
We have. Yeah,
tell us a little bit about.
Very proud about our first initiative here, actually. So, if you want to get in touch with us, actually, the best way to do that is through the CAGE website, which is www.cageuk.org. But we've just opened our first office in Cape Town. Couldn't really find a more beautiful city in the world to open an office in. And what we found actually is that, unlike many other jurisdictions around the world, actually, South Africa still has a relative degree of having a sensible approach to its own communities and to these issues as well. And maybe that's a legacy of apartheid, that they have a more nuanced and sensible approach, and they don't fall victim to fear as quickly and easily as, say, other countries have. And so we thought that because there are so many issues going on in Africa, you've got what's happening in Egypt, in Libya, in Algeria, in Morocco, across the whole of the Horn of Africa.
Right.
You've got the issues taking place in the Central African Republic as another example, that it was important for us to establish a base here where we had a team that was working. So we have a team in Johannesburg and now a team in Cape Town as well, but the main office is in Cape Town. And we're hoping that people will get involved in the organization and really provide some assistance to our teams who are just fledgling. I mean, the actual Cape Town office was only opened a week ago, but we're hoping that some real work is going to start coming out to help, try and wrest the narrative away from this narrative of fear.
Well, look, just in closing, I think we must add we have an extremely wide constitution, a very generous provision to protect the human rights of people, dignity, and the Bill of Rights makes provision for that. We also have a very independent judiciary. I mean, this has been one of our landmarks or hallmarks of South Africa, is the executive and the judiciary are not combined, and it does ensure the rule of law. If you've seen some very interesting decisions, the Al-Bashir decision recently indicated, the judges are very, very independent of any kind of, let's say, political influence, which is something that we can be proud of in terms of our historical and present perspective. But thank you very much for coming in and enlightening us. I do ask that you contact CAGE through the website that Asim has provided, and thank you for joining us tonight. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.